Welcome, everyone, and good evening. My name is Rebecca Jordan-Young, and I'm professor and chair of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies here at Barnard. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this star-studded panel in celebration and contemplation of the latest book from our beloved colleague, Neferti Tadiar. Before I introduce the panel proper and our speakers, I want to acknowledge that the panel was co-sponsored and organized by the Barnard Center for Research on Women, with special thanks to co-directors Janet Jacobson and Premila Nadasen, as well as the fabulous BCRW staff. Sophie Kreitzberg and Avi Cummings in particular worked on pulling this panel together. We also received support from our colleagues in the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender at Columbia, and of course from our events team and instructional media and technology team who are here tonight. Remaindered Life is the latest extraordinary book from Neferti Tadiar, who is professor in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Barnard. Professor Tadiar is the author of two previous books, Things Fall Away, Philippine Historical Experience and the Making of Globalization in 2009, and fantasy production, Sexual Economies and Other Philippine Consequences for the New World Order from 2004, which was awarded the Philippine National Book Award in Cultural Criticism in 2005. With Angela Davis, she also co-edited Beyond the Frame, Women of Color and Visual Representation. Professor Tadiar has been on Barnard faculty since 2006. She came to us from the Department of History of Consciousness at UC Santa Cruz, and before that, was at University of the Philippines, Diliman, Quezon City, Philippines, and pardon my pronunciation for anything that I messed up there. Neferti's academic interests include transnational and third world feminisms, post-colonial and Marxist theory, critical theories of race and subjectivity, literary and social theory, cultural studies of the Asia-Pacific region, Southeast Asia, and Philippine studies. Neferti is renowned, if you put it over here, thank you, and we'll move it in a second, for the rigor and intensity of her criticism, for her critiques. She is exacting and demanding, and listening to her think, or better yet, thinking alongside her, is consistently thrilling. She's profoundly committed to an otherwise world and works diligently, relentlessly, and creatively to bring it into being. So the demanding work that Neferti makes, I'm sorry, I can't read because it's dark in here. So the demands that Neferti makes are often demands that bend us towards more humane, aesthetically pleasing, and delightful engagements. This commitment is central to the book that we're going to consider tonight. Among her colleagues, Neferti is known for pressing us to shape our work around things that we get to do rather than things that we have to do, and for returning us over and over again to the question of how we want to live. So in that spirit, I want to share a very short passage from the book that reveals that sensibility, that determination that even inside the great big crush of global capitalism, permanent imperial war, and unfinished, maybe seemingly unfinishable decolonization, people are already living otherwise, and deep, serious, transformative change is possible. Beyond the thresholds that our histories continue to be bound to, and thereby continue to uphold, with their definition of meaningful action and transformation, another time beckons, the time of expectation for the quantum leap. The change of configuration and order of things can be immediate and very long. But at every interval between now and then, in this time of expectation, we engage in small vibrations of great abundance that appear to bring no change, to never amount to anything, to be of no consequence whatsoever. And yet all the small and medium vibrations we manage to make in and to this system in unorganized and organized ways, reverberating with each other as we withdraw in the smallest of ways from this order and amplify in the largest of ways the forms, affects, visions, and practices of other modes of living, subsisting in this order of life and waste, so violently fighting against its own dismantling and disintegration. All these vibrations will matter in bringing this era to an end. So that's what you have in store, this beautiful piece. I want now to introduce, it's my honor to also introduce a truly distinguished panel of guests who join us tonight to consider this work. Erica Edwards is professor of English and African American Studies at Yale University. Among other books, Professor Edwards is the author of The Other Side of Terror, Black Women and the Culture of U.S. Empire, which won the American Studies Association John Hope Franklin Book Prize and got honorable mention for the MLA James Russell Lowell Prize. This book offers an account of contemporary Black women's culture and its entanglements with U.S. imperialism. Paul Nadal is assistant professor of English and American Studies and an associated faculty member of the program in Media and Modernity at Princeton University. Professor Nadal is an interdisciplinary scholar working at the intersection of literature and economy. His current book project looks at the relationship between novels and remittances in the Philippine diaspora, a chapter of which appeared in the September 2021 issue of American Quarterly and won the Best Essay Prize from the American Literature Society. And last but certainly not least, Professor Jasbir Puar is professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers University. Professor Puar is the author of the award-winning books The Right to Maim, Debility, Capacity, Disability, which has been translated into Spanish and Portuguese, and Terrorist Assemblages, Homonationalism in Queer Times, translated into 4 languages and counting, I suspect, and recently reissued as an expanded version for its 10th anniversary in 2017. Her articles have been published in journals such as Social Text and South Atlantic Quarterly, mainstream venues such as Al Jazeera and The Guardian, and translated into more than 15 languages. She is also co-author of exhibitions for the Sharjah Architecture Triennial and the Sharjah Art Biennial. She's the recipient of the 2019 Kessler Award from the Center for Gay and Lesbian Studies, known as CLAGS, at CUNY, which recognizes lifetime achievement in and impact on queer research and organizing. Thank you all so much for coming to discuss this wonderful work with us. Neferti, I believe you will start us out.
Some water.
Yes, let me get, I'll bring them over. We'll start with Neferti, but we'll take a tiny pause so that they can hydrate. Hold on.
Well, I can start in the interest of time and also, and then drink a little bit. But first I wanted to thank Beck Jordan Young and Janet Jacobson and Premila Madison for organizing this panel. I know that they insisted, and I was really very happy about that. Thank you also to this really, I'm so humbled and honored by this distinguished panel. I feel like, I am so grateful for, your graciousness in accepting the invitation to offer your thoughts, and I'm really looking forward to it. And I want to thank everyone here for coming and spending this beautiful Tuesday evening in this room. Okay. So I just wanted to make a few, it's a big book, so I'm not going to explain it. I'm just going to offer some prefatory remarks. I say in the beginning, above all, that I see this book as an analytical and political tale. I tell to and for the descendants of the colonized. And in so doing, to tell this tale to the descendants of the colonized is to choose to affirm that inheritance. On the one hand, the book is an analysis of the role of imperialism as the process of the expanded reproduction of capital over all of life, a core strategy and relation in contemporary global capitalism and its new political economy of life in the digital age. Imperialism is a relation of dispossession, colonizer-colonized, intrinsic to the relation of exploitation, capital, labor. Today, as much as in the past, imperialism shapes the fates of peoples in a new moment and scale of active wasting of lives, including the vast non-human beings comprising planetary life. Imperialism operates through war and relentless assaults on the independent living of those I refer to as the becoming human, or the descendants and members of the colonized, as a way to place their lives in the service of the reproduction of capital in all its forms, making them the enabling milieus of capitalist function on the one hand as vital infrastructures of serviceable life for capitalizable life, and as environments of absolutely expendable life as raw material and monetizable assets for capital enterprise. On the other hand, the book is an analysis of the importance of people's survival, their practices of life-making, as not only a tremendous source in sight of appropriation of value, which is stricken off the book, so to speak, but also as a subaltern driving force, engines of evolving modes of value extraction, demonstrated, for example, in the petty enterprises of the urban poor, making something out of nothing, their creative capacities to manipulate, lend, divide, and convert material and immaterial things, bodies and relations. These multiple currencies of transaction are prefiguring, if not impelling, the innovations and growth of an uber-urbanist platform capitalist economy. So the book in this way is also a political tale. It retells the tales that capital tells itself, which confines its history to the innovations and growth of capital as its own accomplishment, or in critical versions of this tale as responses to the struggles principally of the working classes of the global north against it. I do tell a story of shifts in governmentality and political economy, which I won't rehearse here, but where war serves as a means of governance, regulated by and as financial enterprise. My own tale, however, foregrounds the immense role of the creative and persistent forms and capacities of life-making on the part of peoples deemed disposable as enabling and propelling these enormous shifts, making possible capitalism's expanded reproduction under the strain of unfinished decolonization movements. This is a global story, certainly, but it is also a story of a great forgotten, the role of the Philippines, that great forgotten, which is the role of the Philippines and its peoples in the making of US global power. The role of the genocidal decimation of the Philippines and its human and non-human inhabitants at the hands of US power since the late 19th century until this very day. The legacies of that relation for empire as a way of life, a global mode of capitalist dominance, the role of and costs to Filipinos of imperial wars waged in other regions, such as West Asia, the role of our own disposability in upholding an American way of life spread everywhere, but also the role of our survival and life-making in the expansion of this mode of life in the age of platform capitalism. Filipinos are the distributed center of this work, my examples, my primary case, but they are not my subject in the sense of a unified, coherent people or community. Instead, they are my medium and form of connection to the fates of the becoming human, who remain the fuel and engines of a global system that is engulfing all our lives. Filipinos, Filipinas, Filipinx peoples are also my inspiration, peoples who have been fighting often to the death against empire and servicing and living life, and surviving with humor, grief, joy in unreckoned ways, the connectivities of their open socialities and mutual shared life, modeling networks of cooperative survival. Vital platforms assaulted and preyed upon, but nevertheless creatively persisting across centuries, sending to a life that is a shared life, which is a life of both the living and the dead, where neither value nor waste reside. They, but not only they, Filipinos and other global South peoples, offer examples of the place from which I tell this story. This is the place of remaindered life, the place of reproducing life in excess of that reproduction of disposable life necessary for capital, in excess of life worth living as stipulated by the already human, the life form of value, and in excess of life worth expending, on which that valued life depends. But part of the reason that this is a great forgotten is not because there is no lack of spectacular demonstrations of violence and murder inflicted on us, as almost centuries of colonial wars and at least a century and a half of counterinsurgency wars waged against us would attest. Rather, it is because our part in upholding this way of life has been so pervasive, so ambient and so spread across the entire global service economy, communicative and shipping industries, the global US security architecture. It's so menial. As helpers of so much life and so many communities we are said not to belong to or have a part in. Serving always as media and channels, infrastructure for others, so menial and reproductive as to be invisible to the very worlds we care for and make possible. I just want to add one more prefatory note on the form and language of this book. As perhaps my remarks might attest, the critical explanatory project of this book occasioned a form of exposition and language that mocks and closely follows, even rehearses, the language and codes of capital, even as it unwinds and unravels these programmatic codes in ways excessive to the aims of explanation. And I do this in what I call eddies, many eddies in the book's movement of argument and extended meditation. It is an experiential, emotive, theoretical language that seeks at once to provide an account of the actual practical logics and operating system of global capitalism, while tending to the pains and aspirations, the striving and strife, the sadness and joys of those who live and fight against the worst and most ordinary exactions of this global life in which we are all embroiled. I do not seek to represent a subaltern people, though the peoples I am most concerned with are the disenfranchised and dispossessed. Rather, through expressive gesture and detail, I seek to remake the analytical and affective milieu that currently shapes and informs how we live and work, what we think and do, by conjuring and presencing life worlds of succor and shared being that vibrate beneath the thresholds of perception of our habitual forms of political recognition and valuation. For all its theoretical density, and I apologize for that, this is a very subjective book. Hence, I say it's a tale. Not in the sense of being contoured by a single subject's view, but rather in the sense that it bears the theoretical perspectives and experiential, sensorial insights and affective currents of many descendants of the colonized, who are my consociates and intimates, political, social, and cultural kin to the folks I belong to, relations I hope that I and my work can serve as a medium for, and that might comprise another milieu for living today. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Is this on? Yes. Okay. I'm really happy to be here. Congratulations, Neferti, on this really beautiful book, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this conversation. On the far side of the liberation struggles of the 1960s, standing in the gap between grieving the compounded losses and romanticizing the victories, the radical Black feminist Audre Lorde addressed the topic learning from the 60s in a speech she delivered at Harvard in 1982. Lorde there cautioned against the tendency to celebrate the glories of revolutionary struggle without attending to the violences, subtending the lives worth living in the post-revolutionary world of globalized capital, attending to those violences through live practices of what Neferti Tadiar in The Remaindered Life calls radical bereavement. Within each one of us, this is Lorde, within each one of us, there is some piece of humanness that knows we are not being served by the machine which orchestrates crisis after crisis and is grinding all our futures into dust. Then she asked the question, who labors to make the bread we waste, or the energy it takes to make nuclear poisons, or who goes blind assembling the microtransistors in our inexpensive calculators? Some piece of humanness that might take its place alongside the wasted lives that reproduce that very scene at Harvard, and the remainder of those wasted lives was what Lorde was after. Some piece of sentience unextracted, unscavenged by a capitalist mode of production bent on salvaging value from all of its others. That piece, that sliver of regard for the life not exhausted in the lifetimes of those warring to remain human on the terms of humanity set out by conquest and racial slavery is also, of course, what Neferti Tadiar devotes herself to in her beautifully written and devastating book, Remaindered Life. Remaindered Life is an anti-colonial feminist book about disposability and survival. It tells us how, it's a tale of how the human functions as a life form of value, how the war to be human and live a life worth living is waged everywhere against the lives of waste and absolute expendability. It's a story of imperialism, not as an economic or political or even cultural project of late capital, but rather the ongoing and systemic dispossession of the living and life-making capacities of the colonized, a dispossession hell-bent on exorbitant punishment for the sins of revolutionary world building. Throughout the book, the word lifetimes anchors and steadies Neferti's account. To the extent that capital requires an ever-increasing surplus of disposable lifetimes as the means of a global life and death economy, she writes, it must in fact destroy the independent thriving of the becoming human in order to transform their life-making capacities into a disposable, even expendable resource, a resource that is turned over for the already human. Lifetimes are indeed the scene of reproduction, where reproduction is not simply a kind of labor that is like part of life, but is what life itself has become. Reproduction is key here. If global capitalism is a revanchist war of punishment in the aftermath of decolonization, it incorporates reproduction into global value production. Imperialism enables productive life, the productive life of capital, through such active wasting in the open-air prisons of occupation, in the cages of prisons, in the maquiladoras, in the households of the global north that depend on the constant circulation and on-demand arrival of good and workers, the great forgotten that Neferti was just speaking of. At the center of this book is a tender meditation on the actively wasted life on which capitalist accumulation depends. In Tadiar's reading of The City Everywhere, what she calls the space of uber urbanization in part 3, called Globopolis, Tadiar theorizes the lifetimes that are wasted or given over to the lifetimes of the worthy. What's key here is the platforming of space and of life itself in city and city emulants, the new closed-off hyperreal spaces that approximate the colonial entrepôts of old. So like high-end resorts, vacation homes, subdivisions, military bases, etc. These are places as much for settling as for subscribing. Settlements redesigned as mediatic platforms that thrive on circulation and, again, reproduction. In the city everywhere, app-based services such as Uber convert what would be waste, the wasted time of the unemployed, into on-demand or on-call work detail. The platform, quote, soaks up the liquidity of lifetimes of the urban excess, Tadiar writes, doing something more than contributing to the rise of a global precariat skirting worklessness. The platform doesn't just change the nature of work. It approaches, quote, a perfect meshing of two orders of social media, the technological and the human. That is, it changes the nature of life, fusing and incorporating the disaggregated human parts of the enterprise as a component media within a total integrated platform, which is to say it programs the function of humans as media for other humans. The platforming of capitalism of life itself thus makes media of humans, changing the very nature of being for the other. Media and machine. If Uber drivers are media, live-in migrant domestic workers are, Tadiar writes, all-around household appliances who save the lifetimes of their employers. It is this mediatization of the lifetimes of the disposable that escapes our analysis when labor is the Marxian foundation and horizon. Tadiar shows how now capitalist production is not about the productive activity of life and labor, but its waste. But even as she calls us to understand the character of 21st century global capitalism, she refuses the argument of novelty. So what the book is after, she tells us, is a perspective and narrative of our global moment from the side of the historical experiences of becoming human. That is the decolonized, right? This is an account of ongoing conquest, of global capitalism cast in the 500-year mold of racialized gendered violence, and of decolonization. Hence, the global servitude Tadiar writes of doesn't begin with the globalization of reproductive labor, but culminates in it. A capacious theoretical account, then, of the war of the humans, the valued, the worthy against the disposable, the recyclable, the serviceable. Remaindered life resists the binaries we sometimes privilege in Marxist accounts of globalization. Resisting a totalizing account of capitalism, Tadiar points out that capitalism isn't simply an endless quest to dominate all of life. Rather, it thrives on, that is, metabolizes, the non-capitalist social formations surrounding it, with non-capitalist social formations serving as the environment or milieu for capital's continued accumulation. This milieu, or these milieus, Tadiar clarifies, is beyond what is encapsulated by the word, the idea of labor. If capitalism doesn't want to make non-capitalist life worlds disappear, but rather depends on their dynamic survival, what are the implications for the lifetimes of the disposable? What are the implications for us, for leftist academic critique? What becomes available in this context, Tadiar suggests, is a mode of attention, tending, even tenderness, that is the very method of remaindered life. To the wayside of that war between the valued and disposable, what would otherwise be a binary, so comforting as binaries are in their solidity, to the wayside of that binary, Tadiar suggests, is the remaindered, the life not exhausted, not yet extracted for the lives of the humans. The remaindered life is comprised of the leftover practices and forms of living, the open socialities of survival, that remain superfluous to the production of valued and even of disposable life. They are superfluous, too, to instrumental critique, the kind of critique that thrives on the melodrama of revelation. Instead, the remaindered life is a political heuristic and an aesthetic principle, two models of engagement which share a method of quiet interestedness, of engagement in small vibrations of great abundance, of attention to moments of fleeting splendor, not made into political ideals. As an example of this method, Tadiar offers the art practice of Filipino artist Kiri Dalena, who in one installation sculpts bodily fragments that can't be recomposed as individual forms, or who, in her film, pictures people collectively grieving those disappeared in the 2009 Maguindanao massacre in rewind. The video reverses the path of history, Tadiar writes, in which the events of power comprise an orderly succession, a forward march of representation. In this case, Dalena works against the relentless march of the time of cinema, as the subjects of her film, the subjects of radical bereavement, drop out of the time of accumulation. Their vitality is not called into the irreversible march of capitalist vitalism. This is a weighty and challenging book. The other words are apt, dense, demanding, one that asks of us painfully sober reflections on the production of life in a time of war. It draws on a dazzling library of liberation, everything from Césaire and Fanon to Federici and Luxembourg, and an equally splendorous array of materials that help us to see Philippine art practice as carefully attentive to, tenderly attending to the trail of brokenness left by Duterte's war on drugs, by criminalization, by wars and environmental disasters, by dispossession, and by the long march of US imperialism. In a world structured by the lifetimes of the valued and the war against the disposable, another time beckons. Like the other feminist of color theorists of empire, like the one who taught us to gather the fragments left over from the lives wasted assembling our inexpensive calculators, to gather with, to gather as pieces of humanness, Neferti Tadiar calls us to this other time, these other lifetimes of the remainder. There and then, here and now, we must hold ourselves in tender regard for the vitality that surpasses capitalism's own vitalism. Thank you for this book.
The verb vibrate, reverberate has been used, and you'll probably notice similar adjectives circulating through my remarks. But first, I'm just absolutely thrilled to be here. And so humbled. I want to begin by thanking Janet for inviting me to respond to this brilliant book and to all the staff who have helped me make this visit possible. A personal note, so I want to publicly express my debt to Neferti's work, to her thinking, and to her intelligence. I've learned so much over the years. I first encountered her work when I was a master's student a decade and a half ago. And I was reading her dissertation, and because of her dissertation, I pursued the PhD. I even went to Duke Literature, but unlike Neferti, I wasn't able to survive Durham, so I transferred to Berkeley. But thank you so much. Whenever I need inspiration, I turn to Neferti's work. There are many ways to describe Neferti Tadiar's latest book, Remaindered Life. It is a sprawling and dazzling work, moving expertly across a formidable range of disciplines, archives, texts, and objects, from Marxism to feminism, social theory to media history, film to protest art, poetry to fiction. In the book's sustained and courageous effort to make sense of our present era of boundless accumulation, forever wars, and capital theft, it is simply devastating. Remaindered Life is a call to arms. It is a monument of hope. For me, the book stands as a rare model, and not to use a financial metaphor, really a gold standard for politically engaged theorizing. The book is provisional, experimental, panoramic, dense, intense, tender, lucid, and stylish. Like Jajanka's camera work in the 2006 film Still Life, the subject of one of the book's chapters, Tadiar's prose style dilates and lingers on. Indeed, the active intelligence behind the book's elegant sentences seems to elongate time itself. The book dwells on thresholds. It lingers on the fragmentary, the tangential, and the diminished, those spheres of life-making activities on which capitalism depends, but which are not reducible to capital valorization or capture alone. Like Jajanka's long takes and steady pans, Remaindered Life asks us not to only endure time, but to seize time from capital, as it were. It involves us, its readers, in a different way of seeing, one which we might describe as an effortful mode of attending to and being with that is feminist and anti-capitalist. It is an attention that is feminist and anti-capitalist in that it names an interpretive practice that looks to people's everyday capacities for simply making things happen. What Tadiar describes as, quote, mediatic capacities that are put toward rebuilding and renewing collective life where it is brutally condemned. As she writes, Remaindered Life, the concept, but we might say also about the book itself, is a place. It is a view from which we might reimagine and remake the world. This kind of critical attention, this call to remake the world, is of course a very difficult work. It is difficult work because it requires us to attend to those temporalities of life-making that seem destined toward waste, the human ruins left in the wake of capitalism's creative destruction. The words that recur, some of the words that recur throughout the book, war, humanity, disposability, waste. And in reading Remaindered Life, I kept recalling Walter Benjamin's writings, specifically his memorable Thesis 9, His Angel of History. Allow me to quote from Benjamin's text. He writes in The Philosophy of History, "This is how the angel of history must look. His face is turned toward the past. Where a chain of events appear before us, the angel of history sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it at its feet. The angel would like to say, awaken the dead and make whole what has been smashed. Awaken the dead, make whole what has been smashed." In one of the interregnum sections of Remaindered Life, this seems exactly what Tadiar aims to do. She turns to Filipino artist Kiri Delana's The Present Disorder is a Order of the Future, a 2010 work that projects onto a bare floor outtakes of 2 of her documentaries, as Erica had already mentioned. Strewn on the floor are bodily fragments in cast, which reminded me of the wreckage of which Benjamin speaks of. And so if Benjamin's Angel of History would like to halt the storm that is Western progress and to bind and minister the wounds of the victims crushed beneath the rubble, Tadiar's mode of attending to human ruins or remaindered life entails a kind of radical bereavement. Here, to awaken the dead means a kind of political communion with the disappeared, to those populations whose value-producing activities we rely on but often disavow. She writes, "Radical bereavement becomes a breach in the order of merely human life, in which the remains of one life can fertilize the life movements of others, a moment when the barriers between the living and the dead, between separate but linked forms of existence, become permeable and social. Personal debts to the dead are exacted, forgiven, or fulfilled," end quote. But remaindered life is not simply an object to be excavated, identified, recuperated, unearthed. As Tadiar said in her opening remarks, the task is not to represent the subaltern. The concept of remaindered life instead is a kind of heuristic. It is a theory in practice and as practice. It emerges out of contemporary political, artistic, and scholarly efforts, she writes, to explore experiences that elude the norms and codes of value that structure representation more generally. This elusive dimension of life exists outside the immediate order of appearance. And so this is why this work of attention, this critical attention, is difficult work, because it suspends the norms and codes that we rely on to perceive reality as reality, right? So in that sense, it's a kind of critical phenomenology that she's asking us to engage in. It's a phenomenology that tries to make sense of the suprasensible order of labor and of life. And this is in part where she turns to the work of Jajanka, Kiri Delana, and the other artists that she considers. In their work, in their aesthetic practices, Tadiar seeks to articulate an aesthetic mediation that points to another side of capitalist production. This other side is not the side of productive activity, she says, but it's expenditure, it's waste, it's the modes of life and activity that are wasted away or diminish. This seems an especially important point that she makes. In a critique of Antonio Negri's reworking of Marx's notion of the real subsumption of society within capital, Tadiar questions the assumption that all of life has come under the control of capital. As she writes, this position of real subsumption does not recognize that the idea of the absolute totality of power of capital to colonize all human life and all social relations is equally mystifying. In other words, it's important to emphasize that under capitalism, not all life is in fact valorized or valorizable, and hence this call to think of and theorize remaindered life, what remains. Following Black feminist post-colonial queer scholars, Tadiar encouraged us to attend to those plural times of making that course through the ontologies of the present. Such lineages, she writes, attest to the presence of other temporalities of living from past modes of production that survive in and as the modes of social reproduction of the becoming human. But the project, like I said, is not recuperative. It goes against romanticizing difference and alterity. It does not celebrate the peripheral or the tangential as in themselves emancipatory or revolutionary. They offer something else, something more. She reads them as resources or forms of knowledge, of know-how that is transmitted across historical and generational times. She describes these as models for trans-individual modes of social living, and which contain in them the durable secret of life. In other words, this other side of production, this other side of life, this sphere of non-capitalist activity or extra-capitalist activity is not simply something one articulates and elaborates, because, right, that could make it susceptible to the subsumption of life by capital. But instead, she turns to these other practices, these forms of remaindered life as themselves ways of knowing. And so that's one of the things I really appreciate about this book, is that they're not merely examples. They're not merely objects used towards, say, the critique of ideology or unveil reality for what it really is, but really as themselves resources for living otherwise. So in these ways, the book for me goes against a prevalent tendency in critical scholarship to reproduce either a strain of Orientalism or a multiculturalist theory of alternative modernities, wherein the excavation of what has been excluded by capital is appraised as something atavistic. His critical value is conceived in terms of the numinous, pre-modern, or folkloric forms of knowledge and social practices. Dipesh Chakrabarty some time ago referred to this as history too, or the histories that do not belong to capital's life processes. My point here is that, maybe I'm belaboring it, but remainder life is not simply this pointing to this other side that has not yet been valorized. I feel like it's doing something more. Maybe Neferti, you can help clarify this other kind of indexing that's not merely recuperative. Okay, I'll skip some so I can. Okay, right here. What is remaindered life? And in what ways can we speak of remaindered life in terms of art, labor, and aesthetics? We learned that this phrase, this concept, remaindered life, is used to refer to life that is expelled from sanctioned regimes of being human. Remaindered life names not so much an alterity to be recovered and revalorized, but rather names other genres of being human. So, echoing here Sylvia Wynter. Other genres of being human that interrogate the notion of the already human. It's a theory of knowledge about the world, about the infrastructural mediations of life-making that give this world, our world, its sense of regularity and ordinariness, its vitality. Remaindered life uncovers how the historical expansion of capitalism on a planetary scale requires a continual replenishment of what Marx once called relative surplus population, which Tadiar argues are subjected today to a permanent condition of the not yet human. And so she turns to Filipino artists to look for these other ways of becoming human. These other vocabularies of emancipation that are not amenable to or are not simply derivative of the language of freedom that we inherit from secular liberalism. I also really appreciate how she turns to Filipino languages and life worlds as resources for theorizing. For example, the Tagalog word pagpapagkatao, becoming human. She also turns to Ilocano for theorizing social logics of gift economies. And It's so in that sense, the book is also a literary and astonishing work of comparison. So the book, as I said, stands as the model for politically engaged writing. It teaches us to awaken the dead, to make whole what has been smashed by learning from the spectacular and mundane ways of surviving, of remaindered life that entwines and envelops us everywhere. So the questions I had were in some ways already answered or anticipated by Tadiar's remarks, but I did have a question about the place of the Philippines. I mean, it's, so the Philippine experience is obviously exceptionally important for the book's project. But it seems that it's important not simply because it's a symptom of capitalist phenomena, but because it exemplifies something about global capitalism itself. And so I was wondering if you could say a few words or a little bit more about the specificity of the history of the Philippines in elaborating what you call empire as a way of life, and also Filipinos as, in your remarks, you called distributed center of the work of vital platforms. So that was the first question. The second question I had was also about the form and structure of the book. I was really struck at how, in its theoretical density, that the structure of the book was also performing the argument of this other way of attending to remainder life that is aware of the risk of capture or of extraction, but the book structure is organized in such a way that there's a kind of ethics to the work of theorization. And so I wondered if you could just say a few words about that. But I'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. This is a kind of hard lineup to follow here. A little intimidated. I have to say I learned a lot about the book from both of your presentations, so thank you very much. And I want to thank, of course, Janet Jacobson and Beck also for inviting me to be here. It's a real honor to be celebrating your book, which is an epic book, as you've heard, and an honor to be in conversation with both of you as well. The epicness of this book is really no surprise given Neferti's body of work overall. And also, I remember reading the 2013 social text article titled Lifetimes of Disposability within global neoliberalism, and I knew something was just gonna blow wide open in the next book, so I was really excited about that article. There's so much to appreciate about the conceptual apparatus of remaindered life as a whole. There's a kind of dexterity with which Tadiar traverses location without universalizing nor particularizing, and this is a story, as she says, about our global present that does not homogenize the global nor reify the local. And of course, Neferti is talking about the Philippines as this distributed center, and also describes this beautifully as this kind of analytic and political tale and a subjective book, which I thought was I would love to hear more about that. There's a kind of tremendous range, as Erica and Paul have already mentioned, and depth of the kind of bodies of theory that are being brought to bear upon each other here. So global Marxisms, biopolitics, Black and Indigenous feminist scholarship, and of course, Filipino artistic practices. In other words, the book does not labor under the sign of any kind of master signifier. And Tadiar also breaks through any number of theoretical impasses that dominate current scholarly debates. For example, she shifts this kind of exhausted conversation about the limits of the human as it is deployed in human rights and other discourses, and the kind of ongoing thinking about the violence of dehumanization to pivot to the normalization of the violence of humanization, this violence being the root of liberal politics. And so here, I read her in concert with others pursuing this line of thought, including Denise Ferreira da Silva, Zakiya Mon-Jackson, Henta Yap, and Jana Brown. But what happens for me in this book is a kind of enactment of a reset of the terms of this debate, with a warning about the distraction of the focus on dehumanization, a warning that suddenly and clearly makes a new intellectual political horizon possible and gives us this kind of lexicon here of the no longer human, the already or would-be human, the word to be human, and becoming human in a time of war. And Tadiar here reminds us that the human is an economic category. And she asks, what, after all, is not the human, if not the life form of value? And then there's also, there's so many kind of points of interruption here. There's a swerve from the discussion about academic freedom in this brilliant chapter that looks at, the Philippines and Israel and their relationship to kind of U.S. empire, which was another kind of geographic configuration that was incredibly powerful. And discussions about academic freedom that have coalesced in recent years around the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and also boycott resolutions, in particular the American Studies Association resolution. And these debates are always about this kind of uneven application of such freedoms. And what Tadiar does in this chapter is offer us a broader historical analysis of the violence wrought in the name of such freedom and also democracy. And she asks, what does it mean to fight for freedom when freedom is a franchise? And we might then also ask, since Neferti and I are defendants in this particular lawsuit against the American Studies Association, recently cleared in the defense of such a freedom, right? The dismissal of the case was rendered through an anti-SLAPP move, or the SLAPP refers to as strategic lawsuits against public participation. In other words, we were cleared in order to have our freedom of speech protected, right? Which I think is really interesting in terms of talking about freedom as a franchise. Remaindered Life offers also this profound working through the individual, which I've been really looking for myself to think through. The individual is often invoked as a Deleuzian concept articulated in his writings on society of control, connected in ways to Foucauldian framings of security mechanisms. Relevance is tied to computational governance, technologies of algorithm, and big data. And so in technoscience terms, the individual is the smallest data point of an inhumanist biopolitics that moves from humanity to pure capacities and their metrics. So it does not rely upon the individual or the subject or the laboring body or the territory or the nation state, any of these molar categories of the social in order to create and extract value. So there, the discussion of urban platforms where Tadiar writes, humans become media for other humans. There's also the discussion of lifetimes, whereby units of time exceed the 24-hour day because individual time is kind of loaned out and contributes to the life worth living of others. The individual in this technoscience genealogy is a violence to the individual, whereby extreme liquidity of these data points secures cosmopolitan forms of mobility. And this is where you focus on Gaza as a kind of exemplary form of this individual mode of governmentality and control. But Tadiar goes further than rehearsing this Euro-American, narrowly focused post-humanist lineage of the individual. And I have to say a fair amount of this excellent work is happening in the footnotes, so don't miss the footnotes when you read this book, because here Tadiar connects the logic of the individual with the logic of the derivative, but also to structures of kinship by way of a critical genealogy of individual social logics that are largely, theories emanating from anthropology, right, where persons are imagined and behave as individuals in kinship relations, and are derivative of plural social relations as fractal entities. So there's a reworking of kinship through mediated platforms, and again, a kind of great footnote where Tadiar refutes the individual as a kind of romanticized pre-colonial entity, and also refutes the kind of technological innovation of this Deleuzian genealogy, but is rather looking at these individual kin relations as related to the emergence of virtual platforms, right? So she gives us a number of examples where they cannot be separated from each other, and the kind of temporalities of both are in conversation. So these are kind of incredibly generative points of remainders' lives. This list could go on. I want to, spend a little bit of time drawing out a point of analysis that has implications beyond what I read as the intent of the project. This is always fun and sometimes terrifying part of putting a book out into the world, when you find out something about its own lifetimes, right? And what it says beyond what you thought it said, right? No, I didn't mean to sound scary, sorry. No. But I want to sketch out the implications of this profound work in remainder life for critical disability studies, Southern disability studies, and debility studies. Tadiar focuses on the assault on the capacities for social reproduction, and part of me wants to hone in on the corporeal implications of such assaults that transcend virtual platforming, to ask about the Filipina domestic laborer, the taxi driver who only starts earning money in the last hour of his 12-hour shift, the Mexican maquiladora worker, those who, quote, wield their bodily times as soft currency, right? As Tadiar says. But there's something else going on here too. Tadiar writes of the, quote, accepted forms of ransom on human health and well-being, even on continued being, ransom on the pain of disability, confinement, or death, which for more and more people might cost more than the worth of their own lives, right? So in this kind of elaboration of what Tadiar calls constant hazarding of lives, remaindered life gives us a theory or theorizing of debility, I think, not based on the body as an individuated unit that is either disabled or not, but debilitation as a temporality, one that's implicated in individual data points, and one linked to the capacity for social reproduction, a relationship between body and time. So I think what we have here is a kind of move from disability as a minoritarian politics to debility as a kind of massification of life as expendable, the massification of the active wasting of life. And there's another passage that I want to quote that kind of lends to this thinking. Quote, it is the relation of valued versus disposable life that underwrites contemporary finance capital as an everyday rule of living and survival, and not just as an egregious crisis-inducing exception to an otherwise human order. Although it is a relation imminently antagonistic, which finds its most prominent political expression in war, it is also widely accepted as simply a phenomenal expression of the laws of natural selection, end quote. So from my own work, I'm tempted to think of, war as the right to maim and the right to kill, and natural selection as referring to the normalization of debilitation. In this passage, I think we have a kind of update to disaster capitalism, once understood as disaster being an opportunity for a different business model, referring to Naomi Klein's work, but now disaster and its correlates, crisis and catastrophe, is the business model, right? What Tadiar calls the vital mortal business model. So for me, this kind of analysis puts this kind of oft quoted statistic that 80% of the world's disability is found in the global south in a kind of new light. And there are any number of statistics from the World Health Organization to kind of look at too, including that 16% of the world's population is disabled, which is 1 in 6 people, that the need for assistive technologies will increase from the current estimate of 2.5 billion to 3.5 billion by 2020, and so forth. All of these statistics marking an increase in the number of disabled people. And again, to kind of, kind of tack onto what Paul was saying, my interest, of course, is not about representing the subaltern, but you have to wonder, these stats kind of beg the question, what are these numbers normalizing? Both in terms of the lifetimes of waste that never become part of these numbers, so in other words, debilitation, and also in terms of remaindered lives, these forms of, quote, independent thriving of the becoming human, and their life-making capacities, end quote. And so I really like this rethinking of the role of phenomenology that Paul brought up, because this is also so deeply implicated in critical disability studies and its North American kind of versions. As Tadiar writes, crucial to the aim of creating, quote, ever-expanding surplus of disposable lifetimes is the disempowerment and depoliticization of the social reproduction and the ordinary social survival of the dehumanized. These violently humanizing liberal projects of political emancipation, of which disability rights, which is a cause reflected in these numbers, is part of, right? So if the conventional mantra of disability rights is that a disabled life is a life worth living, as opposed to a life worth expending or wasting, Tadiar responds, I think, with a radical question: what kind of life? So these implications regarding social reproduction and debilitation make this book invaluable to critical disability studies and conceptual frames such as cryptemporalities, slow life, slow care, slow scholarship, all efforts to articulate how and where bodies are stretched in relation to capitalist time from what Tadiar calls the devalued side of social reproduction. And Tadiar writes that, quote, intensified social reproduction of some are absorbed as the life-making capacities of others. So there's a kind of collaboration between critical disability studies and Southern disability studies insofar as that it largely unites under the sign of disabled people as a kind of pre-given population, even as a global South is produced as the space of a kind of radical cultural alterity. And there are, of course, exceptions to this, right? But I'm talking about general trends in these fields. It seems to me this current binarized structure of knowledge production could be tremendously shaken up through connecting the theories of crypt time to the social reproduction of those lives that are only worthy of wasting and expending. So some conversation partners here include Weidang Treong's book, Refugee Life Worlds, which argues that debility is a structuring violence of expulsion, displacement, and resettlement of Cambodian refugees. Karnitha Mohammed has this kind of framing of death, disability, and debility as actually the prime expression of how apartheid continues as a structure in current-day South Africa. Of course, there's Marta Russell's work on disability and capitalism, where disability is understood as an economic formation pivotal to capitalist expansion that is fed by the Americans with Disabilities Act to discipline productivity, while also creating profitable populations of the warehoused, which is also another term that comes up in the book many times. And Russell's work in general is in line with, if not anticipating, the kinds of cost-benefit analyses that Tadiar flags in the book. In this case, the cost benefits of disability and disabled workers, or as another example of this kind of monetization of these things, the cost benefits, for example, of homophobia as measured by the Sexual Orientation Gender Identity Index, right? And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the recently published book, Health Communism, a Surplus Manifesto by Artie Verkant and Beatrice Adler-Bolton, which situates the value-waste dichotomy as an assemblage that through the war on health positions large swaths of laborers as always already surplus. So I just wanted to open up that discussion because there's so much in the book that's pointing to debilitation and disability and kind of corporeal life that's like, it's there in the pages, right? There's so much more rich material in remaindered life, so much fodder for theory and for prompts for future research. And from my first read, I recognized that this is a book I will revisit time and again. And that's to say, this is a book that is giving of many lifetimes of thought, so crucially needed today. So thank you, Neferti, for the opportunity to read this beautiful, beautiful book of yours.
That was incredible. What a great, great set of comments. Thank you all so much for the, again, for coming here and sharing your amazing analyses with us. I wonder if we want to take, do you have any questions or comments you want to take with each other before we take some questions from the audience? We probably have time to do one or two of those before we go to the audience. Is there anything, Neferti, that you would like to comment on or respond to first?
I'm just overwhelmed. I'm just overwhelmed by these readings and the generosity and care with which you studied it, actually, because it is not an easy read. And I actually learned so much. And thank you for the links that you made, whether it's to Black feminist visions or disability studies. I feel like that was the hope, that it does not speak for only, the experiences or the people that I know intimately well, because I have learned so much from all of your work, and I've learned so much from Black, feminist, Indigenous, queer, trans work, that I feel that, that it has shaped my own sensibilities so deeply, and to have that reflected back is, to me, the gift, your gift, and also it's a political hope that we can see each other and build something, not from any kinds of homologies or analogies or comparisons, etc., but of a profound understanding of some of the connections that we do have, both historically and synchronically, across many differences.
Great.
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
I want to object just slightly to this "not an easy book to read" line, and also this is so dense, this book is so dense, as someone who's been accused of such things as well in my own writing. I don't know, I'm thinking a lot about what it means, like what accessible language is, or what it means, and why it's presumed to be a kind of transparent thing, and also the right to opacity, that I think is a kind of, it's a demand for a laboring through that's not necessarily about, about making things too complicated or dense, but it's actually about you have to earn the right to see. So I just wanted to kind of re-articulate that line about the book.
Thank you.
Can I also say a few words on that point too? So the second question I had about the form and the organization of the book, I think part of what I was trying to get at too, and this is something that you said, Neferti, in your remarks, is the kind of critique that you're giving us in this book is, like you said, is not just expository, right? It's critique here is a creative act too, that it turns to these cultural texts as a resource for theorizing, but in the writing of the analysis and in the active critique that you perform throughout the book, it is also a kind of artistic practice too, and that's one of the things I really appreciate about the book's style. It really is an invitation to make these connections, and in that sense, it's not a sealed book, right? Like something remains after reading it, and part of that is the kinds of connections that, mediatic connections that the book, as a critical phenomenology, as it were, allows you to see finally. So I just wanted to say that too.
Thank you. I just two things. One is that thank you, Jasbir, for that, because I do think that, when the challenge of trying to make something perceptible beneath the threshold of what is so easily legible does require staying with and the language is part of it. It's not obviously a positivist language that just points to things and just, it's not an analytical language by itself, which is why I referred to the whole experiential and emotive quality of it that goes beyond explanation or exposition, because it is an attempt to presence and to bring into being another, and you call it critical phenomenology, another reality that subsists all the time in everywhere we are, but that we fail to see in the manner of the great forgotten, all great forgottens, because we may not have the language or even the habit of regard, and it's the habit of regard that I am trying to get to with this. But yeah, so thank you. Oh, and then the other thing is about the open socialities. I talk about Filipino kinship networks. This is a specificity, which is something I know very well. Filipino kinship networks, the protocols of making kin, which is by no means natural, has never been natural, has always been protocols of the self-reproduction of communities that are very open and have no doesn't have the same kinds of rules as Western kinship, which is why the notions of individuals, et cetera, I wanted to demonstrate that it doesn't depend on individuals and relations, and there's a lot of literature about what this looks like. But I also see the book as a form of open sociality. I feel like it is an open sociality in the sense that I don't speak for a specific sociality and I don't try to represent, but it is an invitation for people, for us to participate in another open sociality of which, there's so many possible members.
Are there questions from the audience? Yes. Do you want to? I'll come to you.
Hello, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I wanted to actually ask about this question of legibility, this question of visibility, what lives, particularly in your text, Remaindered Life, become visible, the question of also reading and how easy legibility also becomes folded into a rights discourse, how often rights and law become the most legible and the most easily read or taken for granted, really. So I'm also curious about then the question of restitution in terms of remnants and traces, particularly in art. I'm thinking of Kader Attia's work, and kind of this discourse on restitution and return of art objects, of stolen art objects, and how exactly some remains and remnants become fetishized or fetish objects, become hyper-visible, become in those folds of what is so easily the obvious turn to return such kinds of objects, and how they don't really answer the question of restitution, but they may engage with repair, and they kind of go into the same binarisms, particularly what does it mean to return? We can always return to that question, but what it means to repair and to kind of create, I think in that work, what does it mean to create in between spaces when such binaries don't seem to collapse so easily, or one cannot return so easily? So how does one create those in-between spaces, perhaps in art or other mediums? And I'm so excited for your text, really. Thank you for this talk.
Thank you. I mean, it's a tough question. I don't know what one can do, but you do already identify all the difficulties in the dominant language in which these objects or the injustices are spoken, and they all speak in the terms of restitution of values. And it's a very difficult thing to not think with value and waste. That was the biggest challenge of this work, because often when we want to do some kind of political practice, we invoke the language of value or we presume it. It's premised on whether it is a valuable subject, and to redeem those who are marginalized or those who are devalued, and then to restore that value. So then if you do not use the language of value and waste, then what are you left with? And that's, I think, the question of living. You know, what would these objects, or what would any of these political practices be if we were actually attending to the everyday practices of living that could not be subsumed in either an accumulable value, an excess that's accumulable elsewhere, which would be value, or the sloughing off of what is not necessary for this political action. It's what's gratuitous and superfluous for an instrumental idea of what political movement is. I mean, I have seen these things in the Philippines where the killing of drug addicts were not taken seriously because they weren't proper political subjects. And the cost of that, it's not even the cost, but just the pain of deciding politically that this was not worth a political movement. I mean, that really, it kept me up. I could not stomach that idea. And so for me, it always returns to, well, if you do not think in terms of either disposability or waste or value, then what is it that you're paying attention to? Is the line that Jasper picked up is, so like, what kind of life? That it's going to come down to this, because this is the feminist aspect of the book. The feminist aspect of the book is, what if we attended to living, right, in the ways that we live? Then how would that, and the thing is, people already do. People already do attend to, the living in which the kinds of living that you can't, alienate and say that it is either productive or not productive, but that the joy and the experience of it is inextricable from the living of it. Well, then, what kind of life would we make possible, or that we do make possible, but we don't really look at because it is ambient and everywhere, but not worth our political attention? That's the question of the book. So I just can imagine that if you know the debates there, that perhaps I invite you to translate that regard to that arena.
Wow, that's all I can say. It's incredible. It's so great. I think we have time probably for one more question, if there is one. And if there isn't, that was a phenomenal.
Can I just read a passage?
Please, would you? That would be great.
I was listening to Neferti talk about the drug addict, right?
Right.
So what I highlighted here, we might say that drugs enable the work of expending their own lives for a living. They are helpers for the help, lubricating agents that enable the liquidity of the poor. It is not so strange to learn from the killers themselves that drugs also enable them to completely expend the lives of others for the killer's own living. But a further irony of the war against addicts, who are the ostensible object of this war, is that they are they emblematize precisely the freedom or liberation from the moral economic order that drives, constrains, and strangles people's lives, the impossible yet addictive desiring production of capitalism with its utopian promise of complete emancipation from a contemptible, denigrated human and non-human nature. In my own thinking, addicts represent liberation from this impossible freedom held out as an addictive ideal that only tethers people to the kind of life they are compelled to live and work for. Addicts represent, then, freedom from the promise of freedom, whose true accomplishment can only finally be death, not as an inevitable feature or part of the living, but as elimination and absolute expenditure of existence. I thought that was incredible.
Let's just thank them for this. Wow. And I want to thank you. You guys have been fantastic. I have felt the rapt energy of this audience, which is really fantastic. People, I seriously felt you so dialed in behind my back here. So thanks so much for coming into the evening, and let's thank the panel one more time for this great. And congratulations, Neferti.